Our introduction to the nurse from Juliet is really interesting. Her first comment in this scene, "Oh, she is lame," refers to how slow she is. In one sense, we're just asked to laugh at the fact that she's old. But also there's a possible character judgment here. She's lame in character. She's not as good a person as Juliet hoped she'd be. And perhaps Shakespeare does this ironically because he knows that the nurse is eventually going to give her advice which she can't accept, and which eventually leads to her choice to commit suicide rather than go to hell by committing bigamy. There's another accusation here. Had she affections? And Juliet's suggesting that actually she doesn't love a man, but also perhaps she doesn't love anyone as much as she should. And again, this could be an ironic reference from Shakespeare, suggesting that she doesn't love Juliet as much as a mother would, and as much as Juliet would hope. And then there's great play made in this scene of the fact that Juliet is so young, only coming up to 14, and that the nurse is so old. And Juliet contrasts this herself. She's warm and youthful, but by implication, because this is set up as an antithesis to the affections that the nurse doesn't have, this suggests that the nurse is not warm but cold, and that's one way of interpreting her actions at the end of the play. And then Shakespeare finally goes for comedy with the rhyming couplet, "But old folks, many feign as they were dead," and he's suggesting here that the old taunt the young and tease them. And I think this is where Baz Luhrmann got the idea to portray the nurse as someone who wants her back scratched and is really interested in her own comforts. And then there's a final swipe that the nurse is pale as lead. Now, lead was used in makeup of the time, and famously Queen Elizabeth used it to make her face appear white and still attractive. It's a dangerous idea, but perhaps he's also taking a swipe at Queen Elizabeth here for wearing too much makeup, too much slap. And next we notice the extraordinary lengths Juliet has to go to flatter her. "Oh, honey nurse," which she echoes again with a good, sweet nurse. She's desperate to get in the nurse's good graces and to change what she normally is. Presumably she isn't normally sweet and she isn't normally honey, and this gives us a good insight into her character. The nurse's reaction is clearly to tease Juliet, so that she responds with, "Oh Lord, why look'st thou sad?" But we might also interpret this differently. It's actually a kind of cruelty that she's deliberately making Juliet suffer. Baz Luhrmann goes for a much more jovial, comic approach. But again, we must consider Shakespeare's game here, and this could of course be ironic, because the nurse could be foreseeing, without knowing it, but certainly foreshadowing it for us, the tragedy that's going to unfold. It's the marriage of Juliet and Romeo that leads to the eventual tragedy. Up until that point, they could have been saved. And then there's the transferred epithet here of "thou shamest the music." She's really telling the nurse that she should be ashamed of how she's behaving. By playing it to me with so sour a face, she acknowledges that the nurse might think she's playing a game, but actually it's a game that's gone too far, and she emphasises this with the nurse's sour face. And we wonder how often Juliet gets to see this. How often is the nurse a sour person, and perhaps cruel? Shakespeare gives much of the comedy in this scene actually to Juliet rather than the nurse. The nurse claims that her bones ache, and this was predicted by Juliet in a description of old folks earlier. But then she comes up with the witticism, "I would thou hadst my bones and I thy news." Witty lines which the nurse isn't allowed by Shakespeare, perhaps an indication of her lack of intelligence as well as her lack of social status. And then Juliet turns to endearments again, but instead of calling the nurse sweet to try and cajole her, she now appeals perhaps to a moral purpose. Good, good nurse, speak. And the repetition of good reminds us that perhaps the nurse doesn't necessarily choose good over evil, or at least cruelty. Juliet refuses to play this game. "Do you not see that I'm out of breath?" says the nurse, and Juliet's reply is actually breathless itself and quite long, and she finally loses her patience. "Let me be satisfied. Is it good or bad?" And Shakespeare deliberately has Juliet echo Romeo's language before he asked Juliet to marry her, when he said, "Wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied?" And so there's clearly a sexual reference here as well. And perhaps Juliet hopes that her sexual passion might persuade the nurse to actually give up the information, because she assumes that the nurse will be interested in Juliet's own sex life, because she's so interested in sexual puns herself. Next, Shakespeare plays a quite subtle game with the nurse, in that the nurse is playfully teasing Juliet. However, her words can be taken at face value. So when she says, "You have made a simple choice, you know not how to choose a man," actually, that's exactly right. It's the choice that leads to the tragedy, and Juliet doesn't know. Of course, the nurse just means to tease her here, and to suggest that Romeo's not really a fully grown man, and if you are to treat him as a man, he's not really that desirable. But just as Juliet knew she would, the nurse can't keep up the game when she's thinking about sex. So she starts on by talking about Romeo's face, and she literally looks him up and down. She moves immediately from face to leg, and then from leg up to hand, and from hand down to foot, and all the time she's scanning that unmentionable part of his body, and she deliberately doesn't mention it. She gets to body, and then with the euphemism she says, "though they be not to be talked on," and obviously she's referring now to his sexual parts. And it's only once she's filled with lust, or at least recognising the lust that Juliet might feel, that she actually relents. And then Shakespeare has some tremendous fun with her language. So first she describes Romeo as gentle as a lamb, which again is ironic. The lamb is sacrificed to God, and here Romeo is going to be sacrificed in order to bring the two families together, which Baz Luhrmann presents as God's plan, you'll remember. But then her mind leaps from the appetite of sex to the appetite of food. So lamb then becomes a meat that she can eat, and she calls Juliet a wench, as in a serving wench. And sure enough, the next word is serve. And although she's talking about serving God, the allusion is also to serving food, which is why she immediately leaps to what? Have you dined at home? And this would seem normally like a non sequitur, it doesn't belong here, but we can clearly see where the nurse's appetites lie. First it's sex, and then it's food. She has appetites which she wants fulfilled. And then many directors take the next bit as stage direction. "Oh, how my head aches, what a head have I, oh, my back, the other side." And this is clearly why she insists on having a massage from Juliet. But then there's this apparently casual curse, "Beshrew your heart for sending me about." But actually it is a curse on Juliet's heart that actually comes to fruition. It's Juliet's love that is going to lead to the tragedy, and it echoes Mercutio's words, "a plague on both your houses." The nurse's words are more gentle, but the sense can still be read in the same way. And again, this is Shakespeare cleverly foreshadowing the tragedy. The comedy of the scene is still in the delay, with the nurse not revealing Romeo's response, but Juliet's language picks up immediately on the nurse's appetite, and she gives up on the reference to good, and now starts referring to the nurse as sweet, sweet, sweet. But again, this is using her own language, the language of food, to try and entice her. It nearly works. The nurse begins to tell her about Romeo, but then uses another non sequitur. "Where is your mother?" And that, of course, is deeply comic. But there are other ways of reading this line. Baz Luhrmann presents Juliet's mother as an incredibly uncaring figure who merely wants to marry her off for money to Paris and cares nothing for Juliet's happiness. But there's another way of looking at this as well. The nurse has taken the place of Juliet's mother, and there is some resentment here that she has all the responsibilities of a mother, but of course isn't recognised as such. She's still a paid servant. And perhaps this could be what is prompting her to demand so much of Juliet in the way of comfort and massages. It's this very thing, the relationship with Juliet, that she's going to miss when Juliet gets married. And of course it does remind us that Juliet is still in many ways just a child, even in Shakespearean times. And then the nurse's accusation, "Are you so hot?" in Shakespeare's time would have meant, "Are you so angry?" but also, "Are you so passionate?" This is a sexual reference again to how hormonal Juliet might be, and how desperate for the consummation that marriage will allow. And this is also brought forward with the pun, where marry elides with hot. Marry in Shakespeare's time was just an expression, but it also has the meaning that it carries today, to get married. And this is obviously at the back of the nurse's mind. Juliet's only marrying because of sexual passion. It's lust, not love, and she can't actually understand how Juliet's infatuation can be anything other than her hormones speaking. Lerman has a distinct change of tone at this stage in the scene, where the nurse finally decides to reveal that Romeo is waiting to be husband to Juliet. But look at her language. "Now comes the wanton blood up in your cheeks." Well, this is a reference to blushing, but wanton here also has an element of promiscuity about it, as though underneath the language she's accusing Juliet of just giving in to sexual feelings again. And another way of looking at this is also as a description of an erection. Now comes the wanton blood up, and it's the swelling blood that erects the man's penis. And this is perhaps echoed in the use of the word scarlet here as well, which may be seen as a condemnation. And we later have the term a scarlet woman to be one without morals. And then finally, "I am the drudge and toil in your delight." It's Juliet's sexual pleasure here, but what does the nurse get? Just drudge and toil. Her sexual days are perhaps behind her, and there's an element of real jealousy here. And then finally, her allusion to the sexual pleasure that Juliet will have at night is also a burden. And there's, of course, the tragedy, which will be a burden that happens as the result of the marriage. And there's also the burden of childbirth, which is reflected in the use of the word bear. You bear children. And there is perhaps a good deal of regret here that the nurse is losing a child when she loses Juliet. And she may hope that Juliet herself will get pregnant again and have need of her. But of course, the nurse is no longer producing milk and will no longer be the nursemaid to Juliet's child. And so perhaps she realises that she is now going to be made redundant. And what place will she have in the Capulet household once Juliet has gone?